So, I have a lot to talk about today, and a lot of it is based around the idea that partisanship has completely eaten our politics to the point where basic facts are no longer worthy of consideration. So let's consider a scenario. Let's start with President Trump and this widow, Myeshia Johnson. Let's talk about the possibility that we have what I've called before a Rashomon situation. I'm not the person who coined that term. Okay, the Rashomon situation, it's a movie by Kurosawa, and in Rashomon, basically there's a murder that takes place, and there are four people who see the murder, but they all have a different recollection because they were in different places at the time. They all have a different recollection of how the murder went down, who's responsible, how the murder was caused. And so this has become known as sort of a Rashomon situation. In this particular case, there's high potential for a Rashomon situation where President Trump calls up a Gold Star widow. The Gold Star widow, it sounds like, was probably politically oriented against Trump to begin with. She and her family were very close with Frederica Wilson, this Democrat congressperson from Florida, who's very much on the left and who's talked about impeaching Trump for months. And the congresswoman was present when Trump decided to call the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. Remember, LaDavid Johnson was killed in Niger, was killed in October 4th in a mission went wrong. His body went missing for some 48 hours, and we still don't know how he died publicly. In any case, the congresswoman said that Trump had been really kind of cold during the call, that Trump hadn't remembered the name of the soldier who was killed, that Trump had said something to the effect of he knew what he was signing up for, the implication being, he knew he might die, so big deal. And then John Kelly came out last week and said, listen, I was present for the phone call too. That's not what he said. What he said was he was a brave man knowing that this is what you sign up for, which is a completely different read. Now, it is completely possible, because this happens all the time. It's happened in your own life, that a conversation happened and two people took away precisely the opposite views of what the conversation was. Right? You've had this with spouses, you've had this with family members, where you say something you think is completely innocuous, and it is taken in the most offensive possible way. That is just one of the ways that the language works. That's the vagary of language. And if you go into a conversation with the precondition, with the pre-notion that the person you're talking to is opposed to you, the person doesn't like you, then it's possible to read their words in the worst possible way. That's what I actually think happened here. I don't think President Trump called up a widow of a soldier and decided to be cold and calculating and cruel. I don't think he even intended to do that. I don't think that he, in ignorance, would do that. That doesn't sound like President Trump. I mean, I've been very, very critical of President Trump, but even that one is a bridge too far for me. That said, it's certainly possible for the widow to take that away from the conversation. So, yes, this morning on Good Morning America, the widow finally appears. And at this point, we've only heard from the mother-in-law, or really the aunt of the soldier who was killed. We've heard from Frederica Wilson. We've heard from John Kelly, but we hadn't heard from the principals in the conversation, right? Trump said that he hadn't said any of this, but now you have the widow coming out, and the widow says, here's exactly how it went down. Here she is with George Stephanopoulos on ABC News.
The questions that I have that I need answered is, I want to know why it took them 48 hours to find my husband. Why couldn't I see my husband? Every time I asked to see my husband, they wouldn't let me.
There are also a lot of questions about the phone call you received from President Trump. I know you were in a car to the airport. Mm-hmm. Tell us what happened next.
What he said was...
The president?
Yes, the president said that he knew what he signed up for, but it hurts anyways. And it made me cry because I was very angry at the tone of his voice and how he said it. Like he couldn't remember my husband's name. The only way he remembered my husband's name because he told me he had my husband report in front of him. And that's when he actually said LaDavid.
So her suggestion is that her husband, LaDavid Johnson, that Trump didn't actually know the name of the person that he was talking about. So Trump immediately jumps to Twitter and starts tweeting about it. Again, is this useful in any way? Is there any usefulness to this at all? Of course not. There's no usefulness to this. So Trump tweets out, I had a very respectful conversation with the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson and spoke his name from beginning, without hesitation. Why? Why? Let's say that Trump is completely right here. Is this a fight he wants to get into? A fight with a woman who just lost her husband in tragic situation while he was serving as an American hero? Is this a fight he really wants to do? Is this a political winning fight? Now, I know that there are a lot of people on the right who do the he fights routine. He fights, he fights, he fights. Okay, punching yourself in the balls isn't fighting. Okay, this is not smart. It's just not smart. It's also not classy. Okay, it's not classy to fight with war widows. Just a general rule, okay? I have a general rule. And herein lies the problem. Everything can be made partisan because, sure, it's true that Trump can feel that he is justified in fighting back if he feels like he is being fibbed about. Sure, Trump has every right to speak how he wants to speak. There's a First Amendment in the country. But it is also true that we had a certain basic agreement in the country, and that was that the President of the United States ought to have a fair bit of respect for war widows, even ones who disagree with him. So what Myeshia Johnson is saying here is nothing even close to as bad as what Cindy Sheehan said about George W. Bush. If you don't remember back to 2005, there was a woman named Cindy Sheehan. Her son was killed in Iraq. She was a far-left Code Pink person. I think she was one of the founders of Code Pink, actually. And Cindy Sheehan was a vocal critic of the Iraq War. And she condemned Bush as a war criminal. She suggested it was his fault that her son had died. Bush actually met with her, and then she complained he hadn't met with her. But how did Bush respond? So I want to show you a video of President George W. Bush, because it turns out that, honest to goodness, if you want a country that holds together, we've talked a lot about character these past 2 years. And some people have said, what's the use of character? All we need is the policy. Does the character really matter? Does the character of the President of the United States really make a difference? And this has been a serious conversation in the country really since the days of Bill Clinton, who had no character, right? Does character matter in the Oval Office? And the answer is yes. The reason character matters in the Oval Office is for the same reason that character matters in your day-to-day life. The people that make you feel like you can lead a cohesive life, the people who make you feel like you live in a community, what creates social capital is character. Social capital, as Robert Putnam, the political scientist from Harvard, has said, social capital is the idea that as a society, we all have a certain given amount of trust in one another that allows us to act as though the other person is not going to screw us all the time. So the higher your social capital, actually, the less you need contracts, right? The more lawyers you need, that's a good indication that you don't have a lot of social capital. Because why do I sign a contract with somebody? I sign a contract with somebody, and I'm very meticulous about that contract because I'm afraid they're going to break it. Do I have a contract with my children? I have a marital contract with my wife, but it's a pretty short, sweet document, right? Everyone has that in the Jewish community. It's called ketubah. But the idea is that in most of your major relationships in life, you don't have a contract. Why? Because your social capital is really high. Right? You have trust in that person. It's just a longer way of saying trust. And if we don't trust each other to have a generalized sense of what's appropriate and what's not, a generalized sense for what is sacred and what's not, then you're going to end up in these running gun battles over stupidity every single day, and you're going to be attributing to the other person bad motives all the time. So Cindy Sheehan, as I said, was really quite horrible to President Bush. I mean, she, again, accused him of being a war criminal, suggested that he had gotten America into the war in Iraq based on explicit lies, that he lied because he wanted to go to war in Iraq, that he was solely responsible for the death of her son. Here's how George W. Bush responded to Cindy Sheehan making all of these allegations in Crawford, Texas.
You're referring to Mrs. Sheehan here, I think.
I'm referring to any grieving mother or father, no matter what their political views may be. Part of my duty as the president is to meet with those who've lost a loved one. And so, listen, I sympathize with Mrs. Sheehan. She feels strongly about her position, and she has every right in the world to say what she believes. This is America. She has a right to her position, and I've thought long and hard about her position. I've heard her position from others, which is get out of Iraq now. And it would be a mistake for the security of this country and the ability to lay the foundations for peace in the long run if we were to do so.
Okay, and this is who George W. Bush was. This is why I have a lot of respect for Bush the man. As I said, I disagreed with him on a lot of policy, but this is a classy individual who is in the White House. I mean, there's a story that Dana Perino told. I don't remember if I actually told it. I think I referred to it the other day. But here's the actual story that Dana Perino told about George W. Bush visiting a grieving mother. And it's pretty amazing. So here it is. He visited a patient at Walter Reed Medical Facility. And right there, there was one situation in which one mom and dad of a dying soldier from the Caribbean were devastated. The mom beside herself with grief. This is from Dana Perino, circa 2016. It was in her book. She yelled at the president, wanting to know why it was her child and not his who lay in that hospital bed. Her husband tried to calm her, and I noticed the president wasn't in a hurry to leave. He tried offering comfort, but just stood there and took it like he expected and needed to hear the anguish to try to soak up some of her suffering if he could. Later, as we rode back on Marine One to the White House, no one spoke. But as the helicopter took off, the president looked at me and said, "That mama sure was mad at me." Then he turned to look out the window of the helicopter, and I don't blame her a bit. A tear slipped out at the side of his eye and down his face. He didn't wipe it away, and we flew back to the White House. Okay, that's what creates trust in a country. I may disagree with Bush on a particular war. I may disagree with Obama on a particular war. But if I don't believe that Obama believes that people who clearly have good motivations, the families of people who have died in Iraq or died in Afghanistan or died in Niger, that those people have bad motivations, that those people have to be attacked, that those people, it doesn't matter what they say politically, at least when it comes to their child or their family member, their husband, their wife. Those people have the right motivations. We cannot have a country with social capital where we trust each other if we're not willing to take the hit once in a while. If we're not willing to go out there and say, as Trump should have just said, here's what Trump should have said. He said, listen, as the person on the other end of the conversation, I did not think that that was what I was saying. If that's how it was taken, then I fully apologize. But I don't believe that's what I said. I would never try to be callous. I would never in a million years try to be callous to anyone whose husband had served the country with such honor and distinction as Sergeant Johnson did. I would never do that. If it was read that way, then I fully apologize, and I'm more than happy to meet with the widow and talk with her and try and clear the air, because I think that it's important that we all be on the same page here. We all know what a hero her husband was. Instead of doing that, he's busy tweeting about how this isn't how it happened. How is that helpful? How's that helpful? And again, you can say that Trump is just telling the truth, but it's not helpful to him. If you want him to succeed as president, he must have social capital with the American public. If you want him to succeed, if you want him to be reelected, understand not everything Trump does, not every fight he picks is a winning fight. If you would pick a fewer of these fights, he would be better off. I think that there's this certain sense that's set in on the right, and it's set in on the left too, and it's very weird, okay? There's this sense that's set in on the right that no matter what Trump does, he is utterly untouchable, because after all, he was hit with everything, including the kitchen sink in the 2016 election cycle, and he won anyway. And so therefore, he can do and say whatever he wants, and he's never going to lose his base, and he's not going to lose another election, because after all, he beat Hillary Clinton, so why would he lose another election? This neglects two really important facts. One, George W. Bush in 2000 lost the popular vote by 500,000. He barely won the election, right? By 2004, when he beat John Kerry by about 1.5 million, 2 million votes, he had picked up 10 million votes. Between 2000 and 2004, he picked up 10 million votes. And he picked up a lot of those votes because of 9/11 and the war in Iraq. He picked up 10 million, and he only won by 2. So where is President Trump going to come up with the 13 million votes he's going to need to win? Remember, he lost by almost 3 million popular votes in this election cycle. So that's problem number one for this perspective. Problem number two is he's not going to be running against Hillary Clinton again. Now, maybe the Democrats are stupid enough. Now, this is the other side of the coin. Maybe the Democrats are stupid enough to run somebody who is as unpopular as Hillary Clinton. Maybe they decide they need to run Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris. Maybe they decide to be that dumb. Maybe they decide that they want to recreate Obama's intersectional coalition, and they fail again. But Republicans shouldn't be counting on that. Okay, Democrats seem to be counting on the fact that Trump has low approval ratings to mean that Trump is going to lose in 2020. That's idiotic. Trump had the same approval ratings now that he had before, and he won. Right? Approval ratings don't mean a thing because he's running against someone. Right? It's a binary election, as we learned, as we were told 1,000 times, it was binary. So that means the Democrats are going to have to come up with somebody. They can't just rail on Trump all day and hope to win. By the same terms, Trump can't hope to do whatever he wants to do and increase his approval rating and win re-election just by default, because that's not how this is going to work. A movie by Kurosawa, and in Rashomon, basically there's a murder that takes place, and there are 4 people who see the murder, but they all have a different recollection because they were in different places at the time. They all have a different recollection of how the murder went down, who's responsible, how the murder was caused. And so this has become known as sort of a Rashomon situation. In this particular case, there's high potential for a Rashomon situation where President Trump calls up a Gold Star widow. The Gold Star widow, it sounds like, was probably politically oriented against Trump to begin with. She and her family were very close with Frederica Wilson, this Democrat congressperson from Florida, who's very much on the left and who's talked about impeaching Trump for months. And the congresswoman was present when Trump decided to call the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. Remember, LaDavid Johnson was killed in Niger, was killed in October 4th in a mission went wrong. His body went missing for some 48 hours, and we still don't know how he died publicly. In any case, the congresswoman said that Trump had been really kind of cold during the call, that Trump hadn't remembered the name of the soldier who was killed, that Trump had said something to the effect of he knew what he was signing up for, the implication being, he knew he might die, so big deal. And then John Kelly came out last week and said, listen, I was present for the phone call too. That's not what he said. What he said was he was a brave man knowing that this is what you sign up for, which is a completely different read. Now, it is completely possible. So I have a lot to talk about today, and a lot of it is based around the idea that partisanship has completely eaten our politics to the point where basic facts are no longer worthy of consideration. So let's consider a scenario. Let's start with President Trump and this widow, Myeshia Johnson. Let's talk about the possibility that we have what I've called before a Rashomon situation. I'm not the person who coined that term. Okay, the Rashomon situation, because this happens all the time. It's happened in your own life. That a conversation happened and two people took away precisely the opposite views of what the conversation was. Right? You've had this with spouses, you've had this with family members, where you say something you think is completely innocuous, and it is taken in the most offensive possible way. That is just one of the ways that the language works. That's the vagary of language. And if you go into a conversation with the precondition, with the pre-notion that the person you're talking to is